Hi guys, let's take a closer look at one of the shortest modules of IELTS. And I guess you guys are really aware of the expansion of IELTS, which is known as International English Language Testing System. And it has 4 modules: writing, listening, reading and speaking. And speaking is one of the shortest modules, as I said, because the entire speaking would be done in a span of 11 to 14 minutes. That is the only time, or that is the maximum time your speaking test would be held for. And your speaking would have about 3 parts. All right, speaking test has 3 parts: part 1, part 2 and part 3. Part 1 is also known as warm up, and part 2 is known as individual long term, and part 3 is known as discussion. These are the only 3 parts you have to face while attending IELTS speaking session. All right, and so let's take a closer look at all these parts one by one. We are going to discuss part 1 now. The duration of part 1 is from 4 to 5 minutes, and it is, like I said, it's also known as warm up. And in warm up session, basically introduction and interview kind of questions are asked. So what do I mean by introduction and interview kind of questions? So before starting the speaking test itself, the examiner would introduce himself to you or herself to you, and would give you a brief introduction about themselves, and they would start asking you questions about yourself, your name, where you're coming from, and the kind of work and studies that you're up to, and all those things. And during the session, the most important thing that we all need to keep in mind is that you just need to answer in about 2 to 3 sentences maximum, and it has to be cut short and on point, and you don't have to elaborate any questions or elaborate any answers. So you just need to answer to the question to 2 to 3 sentences, and the questions basically would be introduction and interview. Introduction means about yourself, and interview means they would ask you general questions. Just to the entire test is only to assess how well do you communicate, not to test your general knowledge or any knowledge towards any particular area. So you just need to answer to all questions in a really appropriate manner, showing off your linguistic skills. All right, so that is your part 1. Now we're moving to part 2. So part 2 is the shortest part out of all 3 parts, and it has only 3 to 4 minutes, and it is also known as individual long term. Okay, and during this you will be provided a cue card. The examiner gives you a cue card, which means cue card is a card that has a main question and 4 sub questions. For example, if your card has describe a memorable day, and it has 4 sub questions: when it was, why it was a memorable day for you, and how do you remember, what is the significance, and all those. So that is a card with such questions is known as a cue card. Okay, and you are provided a cue card during the session, and examiner gives you about 1 minute to prepare the topic, and in 1 minute you can make points. For example, generally candidates prepare it like this: if you get a cue card and 4 questions, generally you draw a cross like this, and you start writing bullet points. So when it was, for example, the question is describe a memorable day, when it was, so you can write it was in 2000 and 2010, what it was, brother's marriage, and why it was a memorable day, because all my friends and family gathered and had lots of fun, and stuff like that. And why do you think it is a memorable day, or something like that? Do you think any questions? Okay, it doesn't matter what kind of a question that is, and you write bullet points. And so you have now a paper, with a rough paper with a few points that can help you to speak for about 2 minutes. And after you get 1 minute of preparation time, you're supposed to present the topic for 2 minutes. So minimum time of your speech or presentation should be for about 1 minute, and the maximum duration is 2 minutes. So I'd say anything between 1 to 2 minutes is good, but it's always better if you could speak for about 2 minutes. Maximum utilization of the time you get is apt. So now you have a piece of paper with all the scribblings that you've done, and you have all the points, okay, points in that and this and this and all that. So now you can look at this paper and you can speak, all right. And the more you speak, the better. The examiner generally tells you to speak until they ask you to stop, so you can speak for all 2 minutes, and it's really nice. So the best way to execute this session is by having an introduction to your whatever topic you're speaking, and then you need to have a body to your speech, and also a small conclusion if you can have. So that is one of the best ways you can deliver part 2, which is also known as individual long term. Okay, so that is how you can execute part 2. Now we are moving to part 3. Part 3 is also known as discussion, and the duration of part 3 is also 4 to 5 minutes. During discussion, the interviewer can ask any kind of questions. So generally the interviewer or examiner asks you follow-up questions based on your cue card, but then they can also ask you completely different questions from your cue card, or your part 2. So that is something you need to keep in mind. So discussion can be about anything, all right, anything, and you guys need to. And for example, in 4 to 5 minutes, they'd ask you about 5 to 9 questions, or 5 to 10 questions in that time. So the maximum time you can use for, or you can speak for, or speak for every question is 1 minute. So 45 seconds to 1 minute is 1 minute is actually a good time for you to speak on every question, or answer on every question. That is really appropriate. So in about 5 minutes, the person can ask you, the examiner can ask you about 7 questions. That is good enough. So basic idea about part 3 is that it's very similar to part 1, but even though the part 1 is interview and introduction kind of questions, and then you answer in 2 to 3 sentences, here it is amazing, it is appropriate if you could elaborate your answers to 6 to 7 sentences, or even more if it's needed, until the examiner asks you to stop. Okay, and the most important thing, don't feel bad if the examiner stops you in between, because it is because he or she understands the answer, and he's done with it, and he's asking another question. All right, so it is absolutely fine to move on. Right, so that is how your speaking test is held. So basically 11 to 14 minutes and 3 parts. Part 1 is known as, like how we have discussed, part 1 is known as warm-up, and during the session, interview and introduction kind of questions are asked. And you have part 2, and also known as individual long term. During that, a cue card is asked, and the time that is allowed is 3 to 4 minutes, and you have part 3 which is 4 to 5 minutes, and during that time you have a discussion. Okay, so that is about your IELTS speaking test. Now, it is important to know the criteria of your speaking test so that you can perform really well, and criteria also tells you how to prepare for the examination or test. And for that you have 4 criteria. The criteria number 1 is known as fluency and coherence, lexical resources, and grammatical range and accuracy, also pronunciation. These are the 4 criteria that are used to give you marks. All right, so the first one is fluency and coherence. Let's understand fluency and coherence. All right, so what is fluency? Fluency, a lot of people consider fluency as the ability to speak fast, but it's completely wrong. Fluency has nothing to do with speaking fast. Fluency is considered your ability to maintain a moderate rate of speech, which means you don't have to speak too fast, you don't have to speak too slow. You have to maintain a moderate rate of speech from the beginning till the end of your conversation, and you shouldn't have to search for words or sentence structures while speaking. So which means it's better if you speak without disturbances, like it's nice if you speak without a lot of fillers. What do I mean by fillers? Fillers are the sounds that you produce while searching for words or sentences or ideas, and that sounds like okay, sure. Any excessive use of words or sounds in between your sentences or in between words are known as fillers. So avoid using a lot of fillers while communicating, and try to maintain a moderate rate of speech throughout the conversation without having to search for words or sentences or grammatical structures is known as good fluency. And what is coherence? Coherence is your ability to have a logical connection between sentences to sentence. Between sentences, to be frank. And guess you have really good fluency and you lack coherence. Maybe you're speaking continuously without having to search for words or sentences, but then you don't make sense while speaking, which means you lack coherence. So fluency and coherence is your criteria. So you need to make sense on whatever you're speaking while maintaining a fluency is how that first criterion works. And the second one is known as lexical resource. Lexical resource basically is your collection or your vocabulary. Okay, so you don't have to use big words if you're not familiar with, but then you should have an adequate set of words or adequate set of words based on the context. So your ability to use appropriate words based on the context that you're speaking is really important. So adequate set of words. You should have abundance of words, and you shouldn't lack words while expressing yourself or while speaking about any particular topic. That is really important. And the third one is known as grammatical range and accuracy. So as we all know, it's all about the technical side of your command over English language and proficiency in grammar. So while speaking, the examiner actually closely monitors your ability to communicate using a wide range of grammatical structures. It includes different types of sentences like simple, compound and complex sentences and tenses. Also the use of active and passive voice fluently without any confusion, and that is what measured in your grammatical range and accuracy of your sentences, accuracy of your grammatical accuracy is measured in this third criterion. And the fourth one is known as pronunciation. So in this category they actually measure your pronunciation, not your accent. It doesn't matter whether you sound like an American or Brit. They look at your ability to pronounce words correctly, and try to avoid, we need to work on mother tongue influence and stuff like that that we have while pronouncing words in English. So it is important to improve your pronunciation. You should have a very decent pronunciation that is not affected with mother tongue, your mother tongue. And if you have a very neutral pronunciation and you are very clear when it comes to English language, or if you're very clear to a native speaker, which means you have a very decent pronunciation, and all these things are assessed in the last criterion. All right, so you have 4 criteria: fluency and coherence, lexical resource, grammatical range and accuracy, pronunciation. So it is really important to understand the criteria really well if you want to bag a good score in your IELTS speaking. So your ability to speak English, your command over the English language is what assessed during your IELTS speaking. So a person with good command would have really good fluency and coherence, good lexical resource, grammatical range and accuracy, and also a decent pronunciation. It's okay to have slight mother tongue influence, but then it's always better if you could get over your mother tongue influence and sound very neutral. All right, so basically that is about your IELTS speaking, and thank you for listening.